Shalom, this is Shira Sherbo coming to you from Torah for the Nations in Sfat, Israel, which you can see Sfat behind me outside on this beautiful day. I decided I want to tell you 3 stories, and you're going to see that each of the 3 stories kind of has a common theme, a common message, and in each one of the stories, you're going to see 3 groups of people. 2 of the stories they're true stories. They really happened, one in recent history and one a very long time ago. And the other is the story of a movie that we saw, a 2017 movie that we saw. But they all, like I said, to me, I saw the same thing in each story. The first story has to do with a guy named Vendel Jones. And Vendel was called Vendy, and his last name was Jones, and so Vendy kind of sounds like Indy. And so there was a movie with Indiana Jones, and he was an archaeologist that was looking for the lost Ark of the Covenant. And so rumor has it that this guy Vendel Jones, the movie of the Ark of the Covenant, was based on his character. So I want to tell you about Vendel Jones. He was born in 1930. He passed away in 2010. He was 80 years old. He was born in Texas, and he was a Baptist preacher. But he only lasted about 2 years as a preacher. After he went to seminary, went to school and everything, he was a preacher. But then he discovered some things in the New Testament, some things that were like anti-Semitic things that were said that were not in earlier manuscripts. And so this really bothered him, that there were things that were added as the years went by. What he did was he left being a Baptist preacher and he started studying with a rabbi. And when he was 37 years old, so this is in 1967, this is a key year for Israel. In 1967, Vendel Jones is not Jewish. He's not Christian, he's not Jewish. He kind of just settles in at righteous Gentile. And so he comes over to Israel as a righteous Gentile, and he's an archaeologist. He brings his family over here at age 37, and it so happens that the Six-Day War breaks out while Vendel Jones is here. And he asks if he can fight with the IDF. He wants to help Israel in any way that he can, but since he is an American citizen, they say there's no way, God forbid something would happen to you, and that would not be good, that we let something happen to an American civilian. So they did not let him fight. But he was walking to Jerusalem, and he came across some IDF forces. And once again, he said, let me fight. And they couldn't give him a gun, but they gave him some binoculars. And it just so happened that Vendel Jones was colorblind. And so he could see camouflage. And they told him to look down into the valley towards the road to Tel Aviv. And he was able to spot camouflaged Jordanian tanks. And so he could see what the Israeli soldiers could not see. You could only see if you were colorblind. And so Vendel Jones, a non-Jew, a righteous Gentile, was credited, this is kind of a little known story, but he was credited with helping the Israeli Defense Forces fight and win against the Jordanians. So after this, he could point out, there they are. So he, after this, he caught a ride to Jerusalem. And he got there right near the Western Wall when they were blowing the shofar. And he said when he heard the shofar, it just resonated in his soul, and he'll never forget that moment. So the 3 groups of people in this story is you have Israel, you have Israel's enemies, and then you have the righteous Gentiles. And that was Vendel Jones. He was able to be the eyes for Israel, okay? And this other story is the story of the giving of the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. So this first story happened in 1967, but you go all the way back 3,300 years ago, and you have something else going on between Israel's enemies, and the people that are not Jewish, but they join forces with Israel. at the time, so 7 weeks after the Passover, which we just celebrated the Passover, we're about to have 7 weeks after the Passover. We're going to celebrate another holiday called Shavuot. Not too many people know about this holiday, but it's ironic because one of the most important things that happened in Jewish history is celebrated on Shavuot, and that's the giving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. But once again, we have this story going on where there's Israel, and there's the story of Pharaoh, Israel's enemies, and Pharaoh is trying to keep the Israelis slaves, and they're in bondage, and God comes and says, let my people go. And so we know the whole story of the Passover. But then we get 7 weeks later, Shavuot means weeks, and we're going to be given the Torah on Mount Sinai. And you read about the giving of the Torah in Exodus chapter 19. But if you look in Exodus chapter 18, you see something interesting about this man named Jethro. And Jethro is Moses' father-in-law, and he hears about all this stuff going on with Israel and what happened with Pharaoh, and so he comes out to the desert, and the people say, Moses, your father-in-law is here. And so it's recorded in Exodus 18, the conversation between Jethro, who's not part of Israel. He's part of the nations, but you can see when he starts listening to Moses tell the whole story of everything that happened to them, Jethro makes this statement. He says, now I know that the God of Israel is above all the gods. And Jethro was an idol worshiper, and he worshipped every idol out there. And he had this knowing. He recognized the God of Israel to be the one true God. And then he stayed there with Moses. And Jethro was the leader. And he could see Moses in this position of leadership, and he said, Moses, let me help you out. And he saw he was very key in helping the Israelites, because he said, Moses, you're trying to do everything yourself, and you need to learn to delegate. And it was just this cool time where this non-Jewish person came and joined forces with Israel and was a great help to them. And there's even a verse in Numbers chapter 10, verse 31, where Moses is asking Jethro. It comes a time when Jethro is wanting to go back to his family where he came from. And Moses is saying, no, don't go, stay with us, and you can be our eyes in the desert. So I think it's very interesting. Jethro ended up leaving and going back to his family. But it's very interesting that here we are in 1967, we actually had a non-Jewish person, a righteous Gentile, happen to be here at the time when we crucially needed him, and he was the eyes for the Israeli Defense Force. So once again, you see that there's Israel and the nations, but from the nations there comes this group of people called righteous Gentiles that latch on to Israel. And so you see, at the time of the giving of the Torah to Israel, it was never meant just for Israel. Like, Israel is the one that it's called, taking on the yoke of heaven. They have this responsibility to be a light to the nations. God is giving them all the instructions on, how to build a society, the kind of home for God, the kind of world that God wants. God's introducing himself in a very big way. There's thunder and lightning on the mountain, and the commandments are given. But now Israel has to stay alive long enough to get the message to all the nations, because this is a very long range plan going on here that God has. God puts his name on Israel. It was like a marriage took place, a covenant, and words were used like forever, eternal, for all generations. So you see, the long range plans is that Israel is going to be kept alive, when other nations, great powerful nations, come and go. And when social scientists look at the relationship between Israel and the nations, they say it's just the strangest thing. They call it cat and mouse syndrome. It's kind of built in, like nobody can really understand why the cat has it out for the mouse. And but Israel is the mouse, and every huge entity Babylonian, the Amalekites, the Syrians, the Persians, the Romans, the Nazi Germany, the Vatican, whoever it is, there's always this, seems like an inborn hatred towards Israel. And so Israel needs all the help it can get to stay alive, and that's where the righteous Gentiles come in. And there's time after time, we have a story. Later on, we're going to read the story of how Rahab, she's from the nations, but what happens? She teams up with the spies and she helps Israel in a very key way. And then later on, you see the story of Ruth, and Ruth is from the nations, but she teams up with her mother-in-law, who's Israel, and she ends up coming into the family, and she's the great grandmother of King David. And King David, you know that the Messiah is coming, and he is in the line of King David. He will be in the line of King David, and he will bring world peace. So the idea is for Israel to introduce the world to the one true God, for the world just to be like Jethro and to say, now I know. And Rahab said, I see that your God is the God of heaven and earth. And Ruth was like, your God is my God, and your people are my people, and where you go, I will go, and where you're buried, I will be buried, and don't leave without me. So every situation we see, there's Israel, there's Israel's enemies, and then there's these righteous Gentiles that come from the nations and join forces to help Israel. And I was thinking, if Israel was a stock, it would be like God put his name on Israel, and when he used words like forever and for all generations, then like when we get to the end of days, Israel is still going to be in the picture, and so many times, more than not, you see that the stock is down, like at the time when Solomon built the temple and everything was going good, then the stock's way up, and then enemies come in and destroy the temple, and then the stock's way down. And most of the time, Israel is like this big, and she's barely staying alive, but she's always there. And at the time that King David was fighting in the armies, he had thousands of righteous Gentiles. They were not Jewish, they were from the nations, but they joined forces with King David. And when Solomon built the temple, people from the nations would come. He said, I built a house of prayer for all nations. So people from the nations would come. They would join in with giving sacrifices to Israel's God. They joined forces with Israel. And so on Mount Sinai, the Torah was given, which we call keeping the Torah Judaism. But you do not have to be Jewish to practice Judaism or practice the Torah. Jews practice the Torah and non-Jews practice the Torah, and the non-Jews are called the righteous Gentiles. And the righteous Gentiles are not part of the tribes, but the tribes, the Jewish tribes, they have all of these tribal things that they have to do, a lot more eating kosher, family purity, a lot more things that the tribal people have to do. But when you come in as a righteous Gentile, you have a lot to do. Like, you're doing all the normal things, like keeping the commandments, you're giving charity to the poor, you're visiting the sick, you're praying all the time to God, you're connecting to God every single day, you're working on yourself, improving yourself. So it's not like, you don't have a lot to do to maintain your relationship with God. And, they say in a nutshell, the whole Torah is don't do to anyone else what you wouldn't want done to you. So you're always working on thinking at the end of the day, can I improve myself in any way? Do I need to treat people others? Did I offend anybody? What do I need forgiveness for? You're always asking God for forgiveness. You're always working on yourself, improving your character traits, doing more and more good deeds. So this is what the righteous Gentile takes on, a huge part of the Torah. The only part that they don't take on is all of the, I'll call them the nitpicky little things that the Jewish tribes have to do. So anyway, this last story is about a movie that we saw called Security, and it's with Antonio Banderas. And it's a 2017 movie, and it's about Antonio Banderas just so happens, coincidentally, to get hired as a security guard for the mall. And he's been in, he's a really big guy, but for whatever reason, I can't remember, he takes on this job at the mall. But we see that he gets there just in the nick of time, because there's this little girl, maybe about 12. She is an eyewitness to a crime, and she ends up fleeing from the enemy. And she gets to the mall in the middle of the night, banging on the door. And so they let her in. And she's like asleep. She's passed out. And so this really nice looking normal man comes to the door, and he's like, "Oh, I'm looking for my daughter." Of course, it's not her father. And Antonio Banderas is smart enough to kind of figure it out, and he sees some clues that there's no way that this is this guy's father, and he's not going to hand over this little girl. This is the killer. This man wants this little girl dead because she is a witness to the crime. So what do you have here? You have little bitty girl that is helpless against the enemy. The enemy wants her dead because she has the truth. She witnessed the scene. She needs to be kept alive. And so Antonio Banderas, there was another security guard who kind of would not have been up for the job, but he gets hired to do mall security just in the nick of time, because he's there at the time that this little girl really needs help. And so the whole movie, it's kind of a cross between Home Alone and Die Hard. It's a fun movie. He has to keep her alive and keep her away from the ones that want her dead. So I saw the same thing. I thought the girl is Israel. She's got a mission to do. She's got to be able to testify to the truth. There's somebody that wants her dead, this cat and mouse thing. They want her dead for good reason, because if they can kill her, then they can change the truth, right? They can say anything they want because there's nobody there that will be alive to tell the truth. And then you have Antonio Banderas, and he represents the righteous Gentiles, the nations. He's there to protect the little girl and help her get to court to testify. And so, anyways, that's what I wanted to tell you, that this is an amazing story that's been going on for thousands of years, this amazing plan that God has about Israel and the nations, and then the righteous of the nations that come and help Israel fulfill her mission, join forces with Israel. Today happens to be Jerusalem Day. And on that day that Vendell Jones hitched a ride to Jerusalem and heard the shofar, that was the day that Jerusalem got taken back from the enemy. And he played a major role in that. And it's been that way since the beginning of, even Abraham with his right-hand man Eleazar. And Eleazar was a key player in finding Rebekah, changed the whole future of the Jewish nation. So this is the plan. This is the way it's supposed to go. And so if you're a person that's not Jewish, you have a decision to make, and it's never a neutral decision. You either are for or against Israel, because when you look at the story of Ruth, and on this upcoming holiday of Shavuot, we always read the book of Ruth, and you can see why, because it's the same theme of people from the nations joining forces with Israel. But you can remember now that there were two daughter-in-laws. There was Ruth and there was Orpah. And I always thought when I read that story that, okay, so Orpah decided not to go with her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law, of course, represents Israel. She was Israel, and Ruth was from the nations. Orpah was from the nations. Ruth made a decision to join with Israel, and Orpah made a decision not to. And I always thought, okay, that's kind of like a neutral decision not to. But what we find out later is that Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David, and Orpah is the grandmother of Goliath. So there's this idea that you can't be neutral when it comes to Israel. And when we do the Purim story with the kids, the story of how Haman wanted to kill all the Jews, whenever Haman comes out on the scene, we have the kids make these noisemakers and boo, hiss. And the message is you cannot keep quiet when evil comes on the stage. When evil comes on the stage, you better get your noisemakers out. You better say something, or it's like you're condoning it. Okay, so this is the decision that people from the nations have to make when it comes to Israel and Israel's enemies. Like, whose side are you on? So you can join Israel, you can convert to become Jewish, but you definitely I mean, if you are in the role of Antonio Banderas, if you are in the role of Wendell Jones, the righteous Gentile of Jethro, that's a great role to be in also. All right, so that's all for now. Shalom from Israel.